Everyone thought she was just a secretary, a quiet woman who fetched coffee, scheduled meetings, and kept the office running. But when Hurricane Zara struck Maxwell Defense Corporation and their most advanced F-22 Raptor was trapped in the storm. With a dying pilot, this overlooked woman did the impossible. She climbed into that $350 million fighter jet and landed it in 180 mph winds, revealing a secret that would change everything. Sarah Mitchell wasn't just any secretary. She was a decorated Air Force veteran with over 3,000 combat flight hours, and she'd just pulled off the most dangerous landing in aviation history. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the sterile corridors of Maxwell Defense Corporation, casting everything in a cold, artificial glow. Sarah Mitchell pushed her wire-rimmed glasses up her nose and checked the wall clock for the third time that morning. 8:47 a.m. The executive meeting had started without her again, though she wasn't surprised. Through the thick glass walls of Conference Room A, she could see the familiar silhouettes of the engineering team gesturing at projection screens filled with technical diagrams and flight data. Sarah adjusted the stack of folders in her arms and smoothed down her conservative navy blazer. At 42, she had perfected the art of being invisible, the kind of professional invisibility that came with being just the secretary. In a world dominated by MIT graduates and former Navy pilots who designed the most advanced fighter jets on the planet. "Morning, Sarah," called Dr. Amanda Cross, the company's chief technology officer, barely glancing up from her tablet as she rushed past. Her tone was polite but distant, the kind of acknowledgement you give the person who keeps your calendar organized and your coffee cup filled. "The Peterson file's ready for the 10 o'clock? "Already on your desk, Dr. Cross," Sarah replied. But Amanda had already disappeared around the corner, her designer heels clicking against the polished concrete floor. This was Sarah's world now. Carefully constructed routine of scheduling, filing, and administrative tasks that kept Maxwell Defense's executive team running smoothly. She had been here for 18 months. Ever since her divorce settlement had run out and she'd needed steady employment with good health insurance. The job paid well enough, and more importantly, it was predictable. No life or death decisions. No split-second judgment calls. No missions where everything could go wrong in the blink of an eye. Through the glass walls, Sarah could see the massive hangar where Maxwell's crown jewel sat under bright work lights, a modified F-22 Raptor that represented the cutting edge of stealth fighter technology. The aircraft was part of a classified defense contract worth over $2 billion, designed to test new avionics systems and experimental flight capabilities. Sarah had typed enough reports to know that this particular F-22 could fly higher, faster, and more precisely than any fighter jet ever built. What her colleagues didn't know, what nobody at Maxwell Defense knew, was that Sarah Mitchell had once been Captain Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell. United States Air Force. She had logged over 3,000 flight hours in F-16 Fighting Falcons and F-15 Eagles, including 200 combat missions over hostile territory in 3 different theaters of operation. She had been one of only 12 female pilots selected for the Elite Weapons School program, where she had trained on advanced fighters and learned to fly in conditions that would terrify most civilian pilots. But that was before everything fell apart. The memories still came in fragments, usually when she was filing reports or organizing meeting notes. The sound of warning alarms in the cockpit. The voice of her wingman, Captain David Torres, crackling through the radio as surface-to-air missiles streaked toward their formation. The impossible choice between following orders and saving her squadron. The investigation that followed, the questions about her judgment, the quiet pressure to accept an early retirement package rather than fight the accusations. Pilot error resulting in mission compromise, The final report had concluded. Captain Mitchell's deviation from established protocol resulted in unnecessary risk to personnel and equipment. The official language was cold and clinical, but Sarah knew what it really meant. They blamed her for David's death, even though her split-second decision to break formation had saved the other 4 pilots in their squadron. She had fought the findings for 2 years, burning through her savings on military lawyers and appeals that went nowhere. Eventually, the stress had destroyed her marriage, cost her most of her friends, and left her with a settlement that barely covered her legal fees. By the time she was officially retired from the Air Force, Sarah Mitchell had learned a hard lesson about speaking up when you're surrounded by people who've already made up their minds. So she had reinvented herself. She let her pilot's license expire, sold her motorcycle, and traded her flight suits for business attire. She learned to type 85 words per minute, mastered Excel spreadsheets, and perfected the art of being professionally pleasant while revealing nothing about her past. The Sarah Mitchell who worked at Maxwell Defense was quiet, efficient, and forgettable, exactly the opposite of the pilot who had once pushed multi-million-dollar fighter jets to their absolute limits. "Sarah, honey, could you grab me some more coffee?" The voice belonged to Robert Kane, Maxwell's director of flight operations. He was a former Navy pilot himself, the kind of man who wore his aviator sunglasses indoors and peppered his conversation with military jargon that impressed the civilian engineers. Kane was competent enough at his job, but Sarah had noticed gaps in his knowledge during the technical briefings she attended to take notes. Small things, outdated procedures, incorrect assumptions about high-altitude flight dynamics, a tendency to rely too heavily on automated systems. "Of course, Mr. Kane," Sarah replied, taking his empty mug without comment. As she walked to the break room, she passed the engineering workstation where the team was reviewing telemetry data from the previous day's test flight. The screens showed flight paths, G-force measurements, and atmospheric data that Sarah could read as easily as a children's book. She had learned to analyze similar data during her weapons school training, back when understanding every nuance of flight performance could mean the difference between mission success and coming home in a body bag. "The pitch oscillation at 40,000 feet is still concerning," she heard one of the engineers say. "The new flight control software is overcorrecting for atmospheric turbulence." Sarah paused at the coffee machine, her trained ear picking up the cover. Sarah paused at the coffee machine. Technical discussion. She had seen similar issues in the F-15s she'd flown, a tendency for the flight computers to overcompensate when transitioning between air density layers at high altitude. There was a manual technique for dealing with it, a way of working with the aircraft's natural flight characteristics rather than fighting them. But pointing that out would mean revealing knowledge that a secretary wasn't supposed to have. Instead, she prepared Kane's coffee exactly the way he liked it, 2 sugars, splash of cream, and returned to her desk in the outer office. From her workstation, she had a clear view of the hangar through the floor-to-ceiling windows that made up the building's south wall. The F-22 sat like a predatory bird under the bright lights, its angular surfaces designed to slice through the air with minimal radar signature. Sarah knew every system on that aircraft, from the thrust vectoring nozzles that gave it unprecedented maneuverability to the advanced radar that could track targets beyond visual range. But knowledge without opportunity was just another form of frustration. Her computer chimed with an incoming email from Dr. Cross, marked high priority. "Sarah, need the weather briefing files for tomorrow's test flight. Storm system moving in from the Gulf might affect schedule. Also coordinate with meteorology for updated atmospheric analysis." Thanks. Sarah pulled up the weather data on her screen, her eyes automatically scanning the atmospheric pressure readings, wind speed projections, and storm track predictions. What she saw there made her stomach tighten with familiar dread. The storm system approaching the Gulf Coast wasn't just severe weather, It was a Category 3 hurricane named Zara, with sustained winds of 185 miles per hour and a projected path that would bring it directly over Maxwell Defense's testing facility within. The next 24 hours, more concerning was the timing. According to the flight schedule, the F-22 was supposed to conduct a high-altitude systems test tomorrow afternoon, right in the window when Hurricane Zara would be making landfall. The meteorology report recommended postponing all flight operations until the storm passed, but Sarah knew how these things worked. There were deadlines to meet, contracts to fulfill, and executives who didn't want to hear about weather delays. She printed the reports and walked them to Dr. Cross's office, where the CTO was on a conference call with Pentagon officials about the testing schedule. Understand the concerns about weather, but we're already 3 weeks behind schedule, Dr. Cross was saying. The Defense Department is expecting results from this test series, and we can't afford another delay. Sarah knocked softly and entered when Dr. Cross waved her in. She placed the weather reports on the desk and turned to leave, but something made her pause at the doorway. Dr. Cross, she said quietly, I reviewed the meteorological data. This storm system is extremely dangerous. Perhaps the test flight should be. Thanks, Sarah, but we've got it handled, Dr. Cross interrupted, her hand over the phone's mouthpiece. The pilots know what they're doing. But as Sarah returned to her desk, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She had seen this kind of overconfidence before, back when she was flying combat missions and young officers thought they could handle anything the sky threw at them. She had learned the hard way that experience and caution were worth more than bravado and expensive equipment. Outside the windows, the sky was already beginning to darken with the first bands of clouds from Hurricane Zara's outer edge. Somewhere in the distance, Sarah could hear the low rumble of thunder, a sound that once would have thrilled her with the prospect of challenging flying conditions. Now it just filled her with dread, because she knew that tomorrow someone was going to make a decision that could get people killed. And there was nothing a secretary could do to stop it. The next morning arrived gray and ominous, with bands of rain already sweeping across the Maxwell Defense compound. Sarah arrived at 6:30 a.m., an hour before her usual time, to find the parking lot half empty and maintenance crews securing loose equipment around the hangar. The outer bands of Hurricane Zara were still 12 hours away, but the air already carried that electric tension that comes before a major storm. Inside the building, emergency lighting cast everything in an amber glow as the facility's backup systems kicked in to supplement the increasingly unreliable power grid. Sarah made her way to her desk, passing maintenance technicians who were installing storm shutters over the building's massive windows. Through the remaining uncovered glass, she could see the F-22 Raptor still sitting in the hangar, illuminated by work lights as the ground crew conducted pre-flight preparations. They were actually going through with the test flight. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she powered up her computer and pulled up the morning's weather data. Hurricane Zara had intensified overnight, now showing sustained winds of 195 mph, with gusts approaching 220. The storm's eye wall was projected to pass directly over their location at approximately 3 p.m. exactly when the F-22 was scheduled to conduct its high-altitude systems test. She printed the updated weather reports and walked to the main conference room, where the morning briefing was already underway. Through the glass walls, she could see Dr. Cross standing at the head of the table, gesturing at a large monitor displaying the F-22's planned flight path. Around the table sat the usual collection of engineers, test pilots, and project managers, their faces reflecting a mixture of excitement and concern. Sarah knocked and entered when Dr. Cross nodded at her. Updated weather data, she said quietly, placing the reports on the table. But instead of leaving immediately, she remained standing by the door, her trained eyes scanning the atmospheric projections displayed on the main screen. As you can see, Dr. Cross was saying, "We have a narrow window between 2 o'clock and 4 p.m., when the storm's outer bands should provide ideal testing conditions for the new turbulence compensation systems. This is actually a perfect opportunity to evaluate the aircraft's performance in challenging weather." Sarah felt her heart rate spike. The meteorological data on the screen was severely outdated, showing projections from 12 hours ago that didn't account for the hurricane's rapid intensification. What they were calling ideal testing conditions would actually be the most dangerous flying weather she had ever encountered, even during combat operations. "Dr. Cross," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but the latest weather data shows significant changes to the storm's intensity and trajectory." The room fell silent, 20 pairs of eyes turning to look at the secretary, who had just questioned the CTO's briefing. Dr. Cross's expression showed a flicker of irritation before settling into professional politeness. "Thank you, Sarah, but our meteorology team has already reviewed the current projections," Dr. Cross replied smoothly. "The flight is scheduled to occur above the storm layer, where atmospheric conditions will be much more stable." Sarah glanced at the updated reports in her hands, her mind automatically calculating altitude, wind shear patterns, and turbulence zones. Flying above a Category 3 hurricane wasn't just dangerous, it was potentially suicidal. The vertical wind. Currents alone could tear an aircraft apart, even one as advanced as the F-22. "Ma'am." "With respect," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger despite the stares from around the table. "The latest data shows the storm has intensified significantly. The atmospheric instability extends well above 50,000 feet, which means—" "Sarah," Dr. Cross interrupted firmly, "I appreciate your concern, but weather analysis is outside your area of expertise. Perhaps you could focus on coordinating the administrative aspects of today's operation." The dismissal was public and humiliating. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks as several people around the table exchanged glances. She looked down at the meteorological data in her hands, data that clearly showed hurricane-force winds extending far higher than anyone in this room understood. Data that could save the life of whoever was brave enough or foolish enough to climb into that F-22. "Of course, Dr. Cross," Sarah replied evenly. "I'll return to my duties." As she turned to leave, she caught the eye of James Hartwell, the senior test pilot scheduled to fly the mission. Hartwell was a former Air Force colonel with over 20 years of experience, but Sarah could see uncertainty in his expression. He was looking at the weather projections with the kind of professional concern that came from years of making life-or-death decisions based on incomplete information. Back at her desk, Sarah couldn't concentrate on her usual administrative tasks. She kept pulling up weather tracking websites, watching as Hurricane Zara continued to strengthen and accelerate toward the Gulf Coast. Every updated forecast made the afternoon test flight look more reckless and dangerous. At 10:30 a.m., she walked to the break room to refill her coffee, passing the hangar entrance where she could hear the ground crew running through their final preparations. The F-22's twin engines were being warmed up, their distinctive whine echoing through the cavernous space. The sound took her back 15 years, to mornings when she had conducted similar pre-flight rituals, checking every system and backup system because there was no margin for error at 40,000 feet. "Quite a machine, isn't she?" The voice belonged to Tom Rodriguez, the lead maintenance chief. He was a weathered man in his 50s who had worked on military aircraft for most of his adult life. Unlike the engineers and executives, Rodriguez treated Sarah with genuine respect, perhaps recognizing something in her demeanor that others missed. "She's beautiful," Sarah replied, watching as technicians conducted final systems checks on the fighter jet. "Have you seen the latest weather forecasts for this afternoon?" Rodriguez's expression darkened. "Yeah, I've seen them. This storm's a monster, getting worse by the hour. If it was up to me, that bird would stay on the ground until this thing Passes, but it's not up to you, Sarah said quietly. No, it's not. Decisions like this get made in conference rooms by people who've never had to land an aircraft in weather that wants to kill you. Rodriguez glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard. You know what bothers me most? They're treating this like some kind of adventure, a chance to test the new systems under extreme conditions. But there's extreme conditions, and then there's suicide. Sarah nodded, feeling a kinship with this man who understood the difference between calculated risk and reckless endangerment. The pilot, Colonel Hartwell, how does he feel about the mission? Jim's a professional. He'll fly whatever they tell him to fly, whether he agrees with it or not. That's what good pilots do. Rodriguez paused, studying Sarah's face with new interest. You seem to know a lot about aviation for someone who works in administration. For a moment, Sarah considered telling him the truth. Rodriguez was clearly a man who valued experience and good judgment over corporate politics. But revealing her background would raise questions she wasn't prepared to answer, and it wouldn't change the fact that the test flight was going ahead as scheduled. I've always been interested in aviation, she said instead. Just never had the opportunity to pursue it professionally. Rodriguez nodded, but Sarah could see he wasn't entirely convinced by her explanation. Well, if you're interested in aviation, you might want to stay clear of the hangar this afternoon. This storm's going to be something to see, and not in a good way. As Sarah returned to her desk, she passed Dr. Cross's office and could hear raised voices through the partially open door. She slowed her pace, listening as the CTO argued with someone on a conference call. Understand the Pentagon's concerns, but we're contractually obligated to complete this test series, Dr. Cross was saying. The F-22's advanced systems are specifically designed to handle extreme weather conditions. This is exactly the kind of real-world testing that validates our technology. The liability issues alone, came a voice through the speakerphone, are covered by our insurance and federal agreements, Dr. Cross interrupted. Gentlemen, Maxwell, defense has never failed to deliver on a contract, and we're not going to start now because of some bad weather. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm approaching outside. She had heard this kind of corporate bravado before, usually right before someone made a decision that put lives at risk for the sake of meeting deadlines and impressing clients. She sat at her desk and stared at the meteorological reports spread across her keyboard. Everything in her training and experience screamed that the test flight should be postponed. The atmospheric conditions were beyond dangerous. They were potentially catastrophic. But she was just a secretary, and her warnings had already been dismissed once today. Outside her window, the rain was beginning to fall harder, and the wind was picking up noticeably. Hurricane Zara was still hours away, but Sarah could already feel the building trembling slightly as gusts hit the massive structure. She thought about Colonel Hartwell, probably in the pilot ready room right now, studying weather reports and flight plans while trying to ignore the growing pit in his stomach. Asterisk. She thought about the F-22, sitting in the hangar like a caged predator, waiting to be released into conditions that might destroy it and its pilot. And she thought about David Torres, her wingman who had died because someone in a conference room had made a decision based on incomplete information and political pressure, rather than sound judgment and pilot safety. Sarah Mitchell had spent 18 months learning to be invisible, keeping her head down and her mouth shut. But as Hurricane Zara approached and the afternoon test flight grew closer, she realized that sometimes staying quiet wasn't just cowardly, it was complicit. The question was whether she had the courage to speak up again, knowing that this time, unlike 18 months ago, someone might actually listen. By noon, Hurricane Zara's outer bands had transformed the Maxwell Defense Facility into a fortress under siege. Rain lashed against the storm shutters with increasing fury, and the building's steel framework groaned under wind gusts that were already approaching 80 miles per hour. The parking lot had been evacuated, with most non-essential personnel sent home hours earlier. Only the core team remained, the engineers, the test pilot, the ground crew, and one secretary who couldn't bring herself to leave. Sarah sat at her desk, her computer screen displaying real-time weather data that painted an increasingly terrifying picture. The hurricane had intensified again, now showing sustained winds of 205 miles per hour with a compact, well-defined eye wall that was racing toward the coast faster than originally predicted. The storm would make landfall at 2:30 p.m. 30 minutes before Colonel Hartwell was scheduled to take off in the F-22. She had spent the morning trying to work up the courage to approach someone else, anyone who might have the authority to cancel the test flight. But every attempt ended the same way, with polite dismissals and reminders that weather analysis wasn't her job. The frustration was eating at her, bringing back memories of military briefings where her tactical insights were ignored until it was too late to matter. At 12:15 p.m., Sarah made her decision. She saved her work, locked her computer, and walked purposefully toward the pilot-ready room. If no one would listen to the secretary, maybe they would listen to someone who spoke their language. The ready room was located adjacent to the hangar, a spartanly furnished space where pilots conducted final preparations before missions. Sarah had never been inside, but she knew the layout from her years in similar facilities. She knocked on the door and waited for permission to enter. "Come in," called Colonel Hartwell's familiar voice. Sarah opened the door to find the senior test pilot sitting alone at a metal table, surrounded by weather charts, flight plans, and technical manuals. At 48, Hartwell was a lean, gray-haired man with the kind of quiet competence that marked the best military aviators. He looked up from his paperwork with mild surprise at seeing the company secretary in his domain. "Ms. Mitchell, isn't it? What can I do for you?" Sarah closed the door behind her and took a deep breath. "Colonel Hartwell, I need to talk to you about this afternoon's test flight." Hartwell's expression remained politely neutral, but Sarah caught a flicker of interest in his eyes. "I'm listening." "Sir, I've been tracking Hurricane Zara's development since yesterday, and the conditions you're going to encounter are far worse than what's being briefed. The storm has intensified beyond the official projections, and the atmospheric turbulence extends well above your planned flight ceiling." Hartwell leaned back in his chair, studying Sarah with new attention. "You seem very well informed about meteorological analysis for someone in administration." Sarah felt her carefully constructed cover beginning to crack. "I have some background in weather interpretation, sir. Enough to recognize when flight conditions are beyond acceptable limits." "What kind of background?" Hartwell's voice carried the subtle authority of a commander who was accustomed to getting straight answers. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then decided that Colonel Hartwell's life was worth more than her secret. "I'm a former Air Force pilot, sir. Captain Sarah Mitchell, retired. I flew F-16s and F-15s for 12 years, including combat operations in hostile environments." The change in Hartwell's demeanor was immediate and profound. He sat forward, his expression shifting from polite interest to intense focus. "Captain Mitchell, I thought I recognized something about you. What's your assessment of today's conditions?" "Honestly, sir, I've flown in some of the worst weather imaginable, including sandstorms in the Middle East and winter storms over the Rockies. But what's approaching this facility this afternoon is beyond anything I would attempt, even in an emergency." Sarah pulled out her printed weather reports and spread them on the table. "The vertical wind shear alone could exceed 150 knots at your planned altitude. The F-22's flight control systems, advanced as they are, weren't designed to compensate for atmospheric turbulence of this magnitude." Hartwell studied the data, his trained eye quickly grasping the implications. "These projections are significantly different from what I was briefed this morning. The storm is intensifying rapidly, sir. Every hour we delay increases the danger exponentially. Sarah pointed to the radar imagery on one of the charts. This eye wall structure indicates a very mature, very powerful hurricane. The updrafts and downdrafts in the storm's periphery could generate vertical accelerations exceeding the F-22 structural limits. And yet Dr. Cross seems confident that the mission should proceed. Sarah chose her words carefully. With respect to Dr. Cross, sir, she's never had to fly an aircraft through conditions like this. The engineering specifications and computer models can't account for the reality of what happens when you put a human being in a machine and ask them to survive nature at its most violent. Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, processing the information. Finally, he looked up at Sarah with the kind of respect she hadn't seen in 18 months. Captain, why are you working as a secretary instead of flying? The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had known it would come eventually, but hearing it from a fellow pilot made the loss feel fresh again. I was forced into early retirement, sir. There was an incident, a disagreement about tactical decisions during a combat mission. The official finding was pilot error. But you don't agree with that finding? No, sir, I don't. But disagreeing with official findings and proving them wrong are two different things. Hartwell nodded with understanding. The military aviation community was small enough that career-ending controversies became cautionary tales shared in ready rooms around the world. What happened to your wingman? Sarah's throat tightened. He died, sir. Following the flight plan instead of my recommendation to break formation when we encountered unexpected surface-to-air missiles. I deviated from protocol to save the rest of the squadron, but the investigation concluded that my actions were reckless and contributed to his death. How many other pilots did you save? 4, sir. Then whoever wrote that report was an idiot. Hartwell's voice carried the flat certainty of a man who had made similar life-or-death decisions. Captain, I've been flying military aircraft for over 20 years, and I can tell you that the best pilots are the ones who know when to break the rules to save lives. Sarah felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. It was the first time in years that another pilot had validated her decision, had understood the impossible choice she had faced in those crucial seconds when everything went wrong. Sir, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion she felt, I'm asking you to consider postponing this test flight. Not because I want to interfere with Maxwell Defense's operations, but because I've seen what happens when experienced pilots push beyond the limits of what's survivable. Hartwell gathered up the weather reports and stood from the table. Captain, I want you to come with me to the operations center. It's time Dr. Cross heard this assessment from someone who actually knows what they're talking about. Sir, I don't think that's a good idea. My position here is already precarious and, Captain Mitchell, Hartwell interrupted, his voice carrying unmistakable command authority. You came here to try to save my life. The least I can do is make sure your expertise gets the hearing it deserves. As they walked toward the operations center, Sarah felt a mixture of hope and dread. She was about to reveal her true identity to the people who had dismissed her as just a secretary for 18 months. There would be questions, investigations, and probably the end of her carefully constructed new life. But Colonel Hartwell was right about one thing. Some risks were worth taking when lives hung in the balance. And if her experience could prevent another tragedy like the one that had ended her military career, then exposing her secret was a small price to pay. The storm was getting worse by the minute, and time was running out. In less than 2 hours, someone would make the final decision about whether the F-22 would fly into the teeth of Hurricane Zara. Sarah Mitchell had spent 18 months learning to be invisible, but now it was time to step back into the light and fight for what she knew was right, even if it cost her everything she had worked to rebuild. The operations center buzzed with controlled tension as Sarah and Colonel Hartwell entered the glass-walled room. Banks of monitors displayed real-time weather data, satellite imagery, and flight tracking information, while a dozen technicians and engineers monitored various systems in preparation for the afternoon test flight. At the center of it all stood Dr. Amanda Cross, her perfectly styled hair and crisp business suit seeming oddly out of place in the increasingly chaotic environment. "Jim, there you are," Dr. Cross called out as she spotted Hartwell. "I was just reviewing the final flight parameters with the team. Everything looks good for a 3 p.m. takeoff." "Actually, Amanda, we need to talk," Hartwell replied, his voice carrying an undertone of authority that made several people in the room look up from their workstations. "I have some serious concerns about today's weather conditions." Dr. Cross's smile faltered slightly as she noticed Sarah standing beside the test pilot. "Of course, Jim, though I'm not sure why Ms. Mitchell needs to be part of this discussion." "Because," Hartwell said firmly, "Ms. Mitchell has expertise that's directly relevant to flight safety." The room had grown noticeably quieter, with conversations tapering off as the staff sensed the brewing confrontation. Sarah felt the familiar weight of being the center of unwanted attention, but this time she forced herself to stand straight and meet Dr. Cross's skeptical gaze. "I'm sorry, Jim, but I'm not sure what kind of expertise a secretary could have regarding flight operations," Dr. Cross said, her tone professional but dismissive. "The kind that comes from 12 years as an Air Force pilot," Hartwell replied evenly. "Captain Sarah Mitchell, retired. Over 3,000 flight hours in F-16s and F-15s, including 200 combat missions." The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah could feel every pair of eyes in the room focused on her, their expressions ranging from shock to confusion to barely concealed skepticism. Robert Kane, the director of flight operations, was the first to speak. "That's impossible," Kane said, his voice carrying a hint of indignation. "We conduct thorough background checks on all employees. If Ms. Mitchell had military aviation experience, it would have been disclosed during the hiring process." "I didn't disclose it because it wasn't relevant to my position," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I was hired as an administrative assistant, not as a pilot or technical consultant." Dr. Cross's expression had shifted from skepticism to something approaching anger. "Ms. Mitchell, if you've been concealing relevant qualifications, that constitutes fraud in your employment application." What we need to do, Hartwell interrupted, is listen to Captain Mitchell's assessment of today's weather conditions. Because unlike everyone else in this room, she's actually flown military aircraft in extreme weather." Sarah pulled out her printed weather reports and moved to the central display screen. With practiced efficiency, she began overlaying current meteorological data with the planned flight path, her movements showing the kind of confident familiarity that came from years of conducting similar briefings. "Hurricane Zara has intensified beyond all official projections," she began, her voice taking on the crisp, professional tone she had used during military briefings. "Current sustained winds are 205 miles per hour, with gusts exceeding 230. The eye wall is extremely well-defined and compact, which indicates a mature, very dangerous storm system." She highlighted specific areas on the weather map with a laser pointer. "The planned flight path takes the F-22 directly through the hurricane's northeastern quadrant, which is typically the most violent section of any rotating storm system. The vertical wind shear in this area will exceed 150 knots, with atmospheric turbulence extending well above 60,000 feet. Our flight plan calls for operations above the storm layer," Dr. Cross interjected. "The F-22 service ceiling is 65,000 feet, which should put us well above any weather-related turbulence." Sarah shook her head. "Ma'am, that's not how hurricane dynamics work. The convective activity in a storm this powerful creates vertical air currents that can extend into the lower stratosphere. The F-22 would encounter severe turbulence, wind, shear, and possibly even structural icing at altitudes where the aircraft's de-icing systems weren't designed to operate." Kane stepped forward, his expression hostile. Even if we accept that you have the background you claim, you're talking about theoretical scenarios. The F-22's flight control systems are the most advanced ever developed. They can compensate for atmospheric disturbances that would destroy older aircraft. Sir, I've flown aircraft with advanced flight control systems in combat conditions. Sarah replied, her patience beginning to fray. Computer systems have limitations, especially when dealing with atmospheric phenomena that exceed their programmed parameters. The kind of turbulence Hurricane Zara is generating right now would overwhelm any flight control system ever built. She clicked to the next slide, showing radar imagery of the storm's internal structure. Look at this eye wall definition. See these vertical towers of convective activity. Those represent updrafts and downdrafts that can generate vertical accelerations exceeding 10 gigaseconds. The F-22's airframe is rated for 9 gigaseconds maximum, and that's under ideal conditions with a fully alert pilot. The pilot won't be flying through the storm, Dr. Cross said dismissively. He'll be flying above it. Ma'am, you're not understanding the scale of what we're dealing with. Sarah's voice rose slightly, her professional composure beginning to crack. I've flown through severe weather that grounded every other aircraft on the base. I've navigated thunderstorms, sandstorms, and winter conditions that would terrify most civilian pilots. But I would not under any circumstances attempt to fly any aircraft within 50 miles of Hurricane Zara in its current state. The room erupted in overlapping conversations as engineers and technicians began debating the implications of Sarah's assessment. Some voices supported her analysis, while others defended the original mission parameters. Through it all, Dr. Cross remained focused on Sarah with an expression of barely controlled anger. Ms. Mitchell, or should I say Captain Mitchell, your concerns are noted, Dr. Cross said, her voice cutting through the background chatter. However, Maxwell Defense has contractual obligations to fulfill, and this test series is critical to our relationship with the Department of Defense. We cannot afford delays based on overly conservative weather assessments. Overly conservative? Sarah felt her military training taking over, the same instinctive response that had once led her to challenge superior officers when lives were at stake. Dr. Cross, with all due respect, you're talking about sending a human being into atmospheric conditions that could kill him within minutes. How is that overly conservative? Because, Dr. Cross replied coldly, the decision has already been made. The test flight proceeds as scheduled. And as for you, Ms. Mitchell, we'll be conducting a full investigation into your employment discrepancies. I suggest you clear out your desk. Sarah felt the familiar sting of being dismissed and silenced. The same pattern that had destroyed her military career playing out again in civilian clothes. But this time, she wasn't the only one who objected to the decision. Amanda, Colonel Hartwell said quietly, I'm the pilot in command of this mission. If I determine that conditions are unsafe for flight operations, I have the authority to scrub the mission. Dr. Cross turned to face him, her expression dangerous. Jim, you're a contractor. Your authority extends to flight operations, not to corporate decision-making. The mission proceeds as planned, or Maxwell Defense will find another test pilot. The threat hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah watched as Hartwell processed the implications, his job, his reputation, his future in the aviation industry, all balanced against his professional judgment about flight safety. In that case, Hartwell said calmly, you'd better start looking for another test pilot. Because I won't fly in conditions that Captain Mitchell has identified as potentially lethal. The operation center fell silent except for the increasing howl of wind outside the building. Hurricane Zara was getting closer, and the window for making rational decisions was rapidly closing. Sarah looked around the room at the faces of the engineers and technicians, seeing uncertainty and fear beginning to replace confidence and corporate loyalty. Somewhere in the distance, an emergency siren began to wail, signaling that the storm had reached critical intensity. Time was running out, and Sarah realized that her confrontation with Dr. Cross had resolved nothing. The test flight was still scheduled to proceed, and now both she and Hartwell had put their careers on the line to oppose it. But as she looked at the weather data on the screens around her, Sarah knew that careers were the least of their worries. Hurricane Zara was bearing down on them with unprecedented fury, and someone was about to make a decision that could cost lives. The question was whether anyone with authority would listen to reason before it was too late. The emergency siren's wail cut through the operations center like a blade, its urgent tone announcing that Hurricane Zara had reached Category 4 intensity with sustained winds now exceeding 210 miles per hour. Through the storm shutters, the building shuddered with each massive gust, and the backup generators kicked in as the main power grid finally succumbed to the storm's fury. Sarah watched the real-time weather displays with growing horror. The hurricane had accelerated its forward motion, and the eye wall was now projected to make landfall at 2:15 p.m., just 45 minutes before the scheduled test flight. The atmospheric chaos surrounding the storm was unlike anything she had seen in her years of flying through severe weather. Dr. Cross called out Jennifer Walsh, the chief meteorologist who had been monitoring the storm from her workstation. "I'm seeing vertical wind shear values that exceed our instrumentation's ability to measure. The atmospheric turbulence extends well into the stratosphere." Dr. Cross barely glanced at the data. "The mission parameters remain unchanged. We have a narrow window of opportunity, and we're going to take it." Sarah felt a familiar rage building in her chest, the same helpless fury she had experienced during her final military briefing, when superior officers had dismissed her tactical assessments in favor of predetermined plans that ignored battlefield realities. The parallels were so exact that for a moment she felt transported back to that sterile conference room where her career had been destroyed. "Amanda, this is insane," Colonel Hartwell said, his voice tight with professional frustration. "No responsible pilot would attempt to fly in these conditions. You're asking me to commit suicide for the sake of a testing schedule." "I'm asking you to do your job," Dr. Cross replied coldly. "Maxwell Defense has invested $2 billion in this program. Our credibility with the Department of Defense depends on completing this test series on schedule. Your credibility won't matter much if you kill your test pilot," Sarah interjected, her voice carrying the sharp edge of someone who had reached the limit of her patience. Dr. Cross turned on her with undisguised hostility. "Miss Mitchell, you are no longer an employee of this company. I'm calling security to have you escorted from the premises." "Actually," came a new voice from the entrance to the operations center, "I think we need to hear what Captain Mitchell has to say." Everyone turned to see General Patricia Hawkins, an imposing woman in her early 60s, wearing the star-studded uniform of the United States Air Force. Sarah's heart skipped. She recognized Hawkins from her days at weapons school, though they had never served together directly. The general's presence meant that word of the crisis had reached the Pentagon. "General Hawkins," Dr. Cross said, her combative tone immediately shifting to professional deference, "we weren't expecting a visit from the Department of Defense today. Emergency situations tend to create unexpected schedules," General Hawkins replied dryly. "I've been monitoring the weather conditions and the planned test flight. I have some concerns about the risk assessment." Sarah noticed that Hawkins was studying her with obvious recognition. The general's expression suggested she knew exactly who Sarah was and why she was standing in Maxwell Defense's operations center instead of flying Air Force missions. "Captain Mitchell," General Hawkins said formally, "it's been some time since we've crossed paths. I believe the last time was during your debriefing at weapons school, before your assignment to the 34th Fighter Squadron." The room fell silent as the implications of that statement sank in. Sarah had attended the Air Force's elite weapons school, a program that accepted only the top 1% of military pilots. Her credentials were even more impressive than she had revealed. "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied, snapping to attention with the automatic response that years of military training had ingrained. "General Hawkins, I'm honored to see you again." "Captain, I've reviewed the incident reports from your final deployment. The official findings were..." Hawkins paused meaningfully, politically motivated and strategically short-sighted. "Your tactical decision saved 4 pilots' lives, and anyone with actual combat experience would recognize that." Sarah felt tears threatening as a superior officer finally acknowledged what she had known all along, that her actions had been correct, even if they violated protocol. The validation came 3 years too late to save her military career, but it meant everything to hear it from someone with the authority to make such judgments. "General," Dr. Cross interrupted, "while Captain Mitchell's military service is certainly commendable, the current situation requires corporate decision-making rather than..." "Dr. Cross," General Hawkins cut her off with military precision. "Captain, Mitchell has more experience flying in extreme weather conditions than everyone else in this room combined. When a pilot of her caliber says that atmospheric conditions are too dangerous for flight operations, intelligent people listen." The general moved to the weather display screens, her trained eye quickly assessing the meteorological data. "Captain, what's your professional assessment of the current conditions?" Sarah straightened, feeling the familiar confidence that came with being asked to provide expert analysis to someone who actually understood the implications. "General, Hurricane Zara represents the most severe atmospheric disturbance I've encountered in 15 years of flying. The convective activity is generating vertical wind shears exceeding 200 knots, with embedded supercells that would tear apart any aircraft attempting to penetrate the storm's periphery." She moved to the display screen and began highlighting specific danger zones. The F-22's planned flight path would take it directly through what meteorologists call the right front quadrant, the most violent section of any hurricane. Even if the aircraft could somehow survive the initial turbulence, the pilot would be subjected to G-forces that exceed human tolerance levels. "What about flying above the storm?" General Hawkins asked. "Ma'am, the convective towers in this hurricane extend well above 70,000 feet. The F-22 service ceiling wouldn't be sufficient to clear the turbulence, and the atmospheric conditions at that altitude would create icing problems that could disable the aircraft's control surfaces." General Hawkins nodded grimly. "Dr. Cross, based on Captain Mitchell's assessment and my own review of the meteorological data, I'm recommending that this test flight be postponed until the storm passes." "General, with all due respect," Dr. Cross said, her voice tight with barely controlled frustration, "Maxwell Defense has contractual obligations that will mean nothing if we lose a $350 million aircraft and kill an experienced test pilot." General Hawkins finished. "Dr. Cross, I'm not making a request. As the Department of Defense's liaison for this program, I have the authority to suspend testing operations when safety conditions are compromised." The operations center erupted in relieved conversations as the staff realized that sanity had finally prevailed. Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders, the same relief she had experienced years earlier, when a mission was called off due to intelligence updates that confirmed her tactical concerns. But Dr. Cross wasn't finished fighting. "General, delaying this test will set our entire program back by months. The Pentagon has already expressed concerns about Maxwell Defense's ability to meet delivery schedules. Another delay could jeopardize the entire contract. Better to jeopardize a contract than to jeopardize lives," Colonel Hartwell said firmly. "Amanda, I've been flying for the military and defense contractors for over 20 years. Sometimes the most important decision a pilot can make is the decision not to fly." Sarah looked around the room at the faces of the engineers and technicians, seeing a mixture of relief and uncertainty. Many of them had been caught between corporate pressure and professional concerns, wanting to voice safety objections, but lacking the expertise or authority to challenge the schedule. Dr. Cross, General Hawkins said with finality, "The test flight is postponed. Captain Mitchell and Colonel Hartwell will work with your meteorology team to establish new testing parameters once the storm passes." As the immediate crisis subsided, Sarah realized that she had not only prevented a potentially catastrophic accident, but had also been publicly vindicated by one of the most senior officers in the Air Force. Her expertise had been acknowledged, her judgment validated, and her warnings heeded. But even as she savored the moment of professional recognition, Sarah could hear Hurricane Zara growing stronger outside. The storm was far from over, and she had a feeling that the day's challenges were just beginning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The postponement of the test flight brought a temporary sense of relief to the operations center. But Hurricane Zara continued its relentless approach toward the Gulf Coast. Outside the Maxwell Defense Facility, the storm had transformed the landscape into an apocalyptic scene of horizontal rain, debris-filled air, and wind speeds that could knock a grown man off his feet. Sarah found herself in an unprecedented position. For the first time in 3 years, her expertise was not only acknowledged but actively sought out. General Hawkins had requested that she work with the meteorology team to establish new safety protocols for extreme weather testing, while Colonel Hartwell had asked her to review the F-22's flight systems specifications to identify potential vulnerabilities in severe atmospheric conditions. Captain Mitchell called Dr. Jennifer Walsh from her meteorology workstation. "Could you take a look at these atmospheric pressure readings? I'm seeing some patterns that don't match our predictive models." Sarah moved to Walsh's station, grateful to be working alongside professionals who valued her input rather than dismissing it. The meteorologist was a woman in her early 40s with the kind of focused intensity that marked the best weather specialists. "What are you seeing?" Sarah asked, studying the data displays. "Look at this pressure gradient." Walsh pointed to a series of readings from weather stations along the coast. "The hurricane's forward motion has slowed significantly in the last hour, but the rotational velocity is still increasing. That's unusual for a storm this close to landfall." Sarah frowned as she analyzed the patterns. In her years of flying in severe weather, she had learned to read atmospheric conditions as a form of tactical intelligence. What she saw on Walsh's screens was deeply concerning. "It's stalling," Sarah said quietly. "The storm is losing forward momentum, which means it's going to Syria and intensify. We could be looking at a Category 5 hurricane by the time it makes landfall." Walsh's expression grew pale. "That would put sustained winds over 220 miles per hour. The building isn't rated for that kind of wind load." Across the operations center, Sarah could hear General Hawkins coordinating with Pentagon officials about evacuation procedures and emergency response protocols. The conversation was conducted in the calm, professional tones that military officers used when discussing potentially catastrophic situations. "All non-essential personnel need to be evacuated immediately," the general was saying. "I want this facility cleared, except for core security and emergency response teams." Dr. Cross, who had been notably quiet since the general's arrival, finally spoke up. "General, what about the F-22? We can't leave a $350 million aircraft exposed to hurricane force winds." "The aircraft is secured in the main hangar, General," Hawkins replied. "That structure is rated for winds up to 250 miles per hour. The F-22 will be safer there than anywhere else on the base." Sarah looked through the reinforced windows toward the massive hangar where the fighter jet waited under bright emergency lighting. The structure was indeed impressive, a fortress of steel and concrete designed to protect some of the most valuable military assets in the world. But even the best engineered buildings had their limits. "General," Sarah said, approaching Hawkins with a new concern, "I've been reviewing the facility's structural specifications. The main hangar is rated for sustained winds of 250 miles per hour. But if Hurricane Zara reaches Category 5 intensity with gusts exceeding 280 miles per hour, the building could fail, General Hawkins finished grimly. Captain, what would you recommend? Sarah thought for a moment, her mind automatically shifting into the tactical planning mode that had served her during combat operations. Mom, the safest option would be to relocate the aircraft to an inland facility. But given the storm's approach speed and the time required for flight preparation, we don't have time for a conventional relocation, Colonel Hartwell interjected, joining their conversation. It would take at least 2 hours to complete pre-flight checks and file a flight plan to an alternate facility. By then, the storm will be directly overhead. General Hawkins studied the weather projections on the nearest monitor. What about emergency evacuation protocols? Could the F-22 be flown out quickly if the hangar's structural integrity becomes compromised? Sarah exchanged glances with Hartwell, both of them understanding the implications of what the general was suggesting. Flying the F-22 in hurricane conditions wasn't just dangerous. It was the kind of mission that would challenge even the most experienced pilots. Theoretically possible, Hartwell said carefully, but it would require a pilot with extensive experience in extreme weather flying. The margin for error would be essentially zero. I could do it, Sarah said quietly. The words were out of her mouth before she fully realized she had spoken them. General Hawkins, Colonel Hartwell, and Dr. Walsh all turned to stare at her with expressions ranging from surprise to concern. Captain Mitchell, General Hawkins said carefully, you haven't flown an active military aircraft in 3 years. The F-22 is one of the most complex fighters ever built, with systems and capabilities that require extensive training to master. Yes, ma'am, but I've maintained my flight currency through civilian flying, and I've studied the F-22's technical specifications extensively during my time here at Maxwell Defense. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she spoke. More importantly, I have more experience flying in severe weather conditions than any other pilot currently on this base. Colonel Hartwell was studying her with the appraising look of a professional aviator evaluating a colleague's capabilities. Sarah, the F-22's fly-by-wire systems are significantly different from the F-15s and F-16s you flew. The learning curve is steep, even for experienced pilots. Sir, I understand the risks, Sarah replied. But if Hurricane Zara reaches Category 5 intensity and the hangar's structural integrity is compromised, someone will need to get that aircraft airborne quickly. I'm the only pilot here with both the weather flying experience and the motivation to attempt such a mission. Dr. Walsh looked up from her meteorological displays with growing alarm. The storm's forward motion has slowed even more. We're now looking at landfall in approximately 90 minutes, with sustained winds potentially reaching 240 miles per hour. The implications of those numbers hit everyone in the room simultaneously. Hurricane Zara was becoming a monster storm that would test every structure and system at the Maxwell Defense Facility. The carefully planned evacuation procedures and structural protections might not be sufficient for what was approaching. Captain Mitchell, General Hawkins said slowly, I want you to work with Colonel Hartwell on emergency evacuation procedures for the F-22. I'm not authorizing anything yet, but I want to know what our options are if the situation deteriorates. Further, Sarah felt her pulse quicken with the familiar mixture of excitement and fear that came with preparing for a dangerous mission. After 3 years of administrative work and professional invisibility, she was being asked to do what she did best: plan for the impossible and prepare to execute when others couldn't. Yes, ma'am, Sarah replied. We'll have contingency plans ready within the hour. As she and Hartwell moved toward the flight planning station, Sarah caught a glimpse of Dr. Cross watching them with an expression of barely concealed resentment. The corporate executive clearly understood that the crisis was shifting authority away from business concerns toward operational necessities, and she didn't like the implications. But Sarah no longer cared about corporate politics or administrative hierarchies. Hurricane Zara was approaching with unprecedented fury, and there was a very real possibility that before the day was over, she would find herself back in the cockpit of a fighter jet, facing atmospheric conditions that would challenge every corvée skill she had ever learned. The calm before the storm was ending, and Sarah Mitchell was about to discover whether 3 years away from military flying had dulled her edge or simply made her more determined to prove that some skills were never truly lost. Outside, the wind continued to build, and the first outer bands of Hurricane Zara began to rake the facility with rain and debris. Time was running out, and decisions would soon need to be made that could determine not just the fate of a $350 million aircraft, but the lives of everyone who remained. At Maxwell Defense, at 2:45 p.m., Hurricane Zara made landfall with the fury of a force beyond human comprehension. The Maxwell Defense facility shuddered under the assault of 245 mph sustained winds, while the emergency lighting flickered and sparked as power lines snapped like guitar strings across the surrounding area. In the operations center, the few remaining staff watched in horrified fascination as their instruments registered wind speeds that exceeded the design parameters of nearly every structure on the base. Sarah stood beside Colonel Hartwell at the flight planning station, both of them wearing flight suits that had been hastily retrieved from the pilot ready room. The emergency evacuation plans for the F-22 were complete, though both pilots understood that what they were contemplating was less a flight plan than a calculated act of controlled desperation. Structural integrity alert from Hangar 1 called out Dr. Walsh from her monitoring station. We're seeing stress fractures in the primary support beams. The building is beginning to fail. Through the reinforced windows, Sarah could see the massive hangar swaying under the hurricane's assault. The structure was designed to withstand extraordinary forces, but Hurricane Zara was delivering wind loads that pushed every safety margin to its absolute limit. Worse, the storm was showing no signs of weakening, if anything. The eye wall seemed to be tightening as it moved inland, concentrating its devastating power into an increasingly compact area. General Hawkins moved to the central command station, her expression grim as she reviewed structural engineering reports from facilities across the base. How long before the hangar becomes unsafe? At current wind speeds, we have maybe 30 minutes before catastrophic failure becomes likely, replied Tom Rodriguez, the maintenance chief who had remained behind to monitor the aircraft. The F-22 needs to be moved now, or we risk losing it entirely. Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate with the familiar pre-mission adrenaline that had once been as natural as breathing. After 3 years behind a desk, the prospect of climbing back into a fighter jet under emergency conditions was both terrifying and exhilarating. "General," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them, "I'm ready to attempt the evacuation flight." "Captain Mitchell," General Hawkins replied, "I want to be absolutely clear about what you're volunteering for. You'll be taking off in winds that exceed the F-22's certified operating limits, flying through atmospheric conditions that could destroy the aircraft, and attempting to land at an alternate facility that may or may not be accessible due to storm damage." "Yes, ma'am. I understand the risks." Colonel Hartwell stepped forward. "General, I should be the one to fly this mission. I'm the designated test pilot for this aircraft, and I have more recent experience with the F-22 systems." "Jim," Sarah said quietly, "you're a good pilot, but you've never flown in conditions like this." "I have. Combat operations in the Middle East taught me to fly when the weather wanted to kill me, when the aircraft was damaged, and when mission success meant accepting risks that would terrify most pilots." She turned to address General Hawkins directly. "Ma'am, during my service with the 34th Fighter Squadron, I flew successful missions in sandstorms that grounded every other aircraft on the base. I've landed damaged fighters on aircraft carriers in heavy seas, and I've navigated through thunderstorm systems that generated vertical wind shears exceeding 100 knots. This is different, Sarah, Hartwell insisted. Hurricane Zara is generating atmospheric conditions that are beyond anything you encountered in the military. The vertical wind shears alone could exceed 200 knots. Which is exactly why it has to be me, Sarah replied. Sir, I'm not saying this mission is safe, it's not. I'm saying that if anyone can get the F-22 through this storm, it's someone who's learned to make the impossible look routine. A new alarm sounded from the hangar monitoring station, its urgent tone cutting through the background noise of the storm. Catastrophic structural failure imminent, announced the automated warning system. All personnel evacuate Hangar 1. Immediately. General Hawkins looked at the weather displays, the structural engineering reports, and the two pilots standing ready to risk their lives for a military asset. The decision she was about to make would either save a $350 million aircraft or cost the life of one of the most experienced weather pilots in the Air Force. Captain Mitchell, she said finally, you are authorized to attempt emergency evacuation of the F-22. Colonel Hartwell will serve as your ground control coordinator and provide technical support. Sarah felt a surge of determination mixed with terror. She was about to attempt something that violated every safety protocol ever written for military aviation. But sometimes, when conventional wisdom failed and circumstances demanded the impossible, the only option was to trust in training, experience, and the kind of professional courage that separated true pilots from people who merely flew aircraft. Thank you, General. I won't let you down. Captain, General Hawkins added, if at any point during the mission you determine that conditions are beyond your capabilities, abort immediately. No aircraft is worth losing an experienced pilot. Sarah nodded. Though they both understood that once she was airborne in hurricane conditions, aborting might not be possible. The F-22 would either make it to safety, or it would become another casualty of Hurricane Zara's unprecedented fury. As she and Hartwell prepared to move to the hangar, Dr. Cross appeared beside them, her earlier antagonism replaced by genuine concern. Captain Mitchell, I owe you an apology. I let corporate pressure override professional judgment, and I nearly got people killed because of it. Dr. Cross, Sarah replied, we all make mistakes under pressure. What matters is learning from them. If you successfully evacuate the F-22, Maxwell Defense would like to offer you a position as our Chief Safety Officer. Your expertise is exactly what this company needs to prevent future incidents. Sarah managed a small smile despite the terror of what she was about to attempt. Let's see if I survive the next hour before we discuss career opportunities. The journey from the operations center to Hangar 1 required fighting through wind that threatened to knock them off their feet at every step. Sarah and Hartwell moved in a low crouch, using guide ropes that maintenance crews had installed between buildings. The air was filled with debris, chunks of metal roofing, tree branches, and unidentifiable objects that Hurricane Zara had torn from structures across the region. When they reached the hangar, Sarah could see the massive steel beams beginning to twist under the extraordinary wind loads. The F-22 sat in the center of the structure like a caged predator, its angular surfaces gleaming under the emergency lighting. Ground crews were already removing the final tie-down cables and safety equipment, preparing the aircraft for what might be its last flight. Sarah, Hartwell said as they approached the fighter jet, once you're airborne, you'll be on your own. The control tower is shut down, radar is offline, and most communication systems are compromised. You'll be flying blind through the worst weather conditions any pilot has ever attempted. Sarah looked up at the F-22's cockpit, its sophisticated displays and controls representing the pinnacle of aviation technology. In a few minutes, she would be trusting her life to systems she had studied but never flown, attempting a mission that experienced test pilots wouldn't consider under ideal. Conditions. Jim, she said quietly, if I don't make it through this, make sure the official report states that the mission was attempted because no other options existed. I don't want my family to think I died because of reckless heroics. You're going to make it, Sarah. You're the best weather pilot I've ever met, and if anyone can get through Hurricane Zara, it's you. As Sarah climbed the ladder to the F-22's cockpit, she could feel the hangar beginning to sway more violently under the storm's assault. Time had run out for hesitation and second-guessing. In the next few minutes, she would either prove that experience and skill could triumph over impossible conditions, or she would become another cautionary tale about the limits of human capabilities. Hurricane Zara was waiting outside, and Sarah Mitchell was about to fly directly into its heart. The F-22's cockpit enveloped Sarah like a technological cocoon, its heads-up display and multifunctional screens glowing with information that would have overwhelmed a lesser pilot. But as she ran through the abbreviated startup sequence, muscle memory from thousands of hours in fighter aircraft took over. Her hands moved automatically across the controls while her mind processed the complex systems integration that made the Raptor one of the most sophisticated machines ever built. Outside the hangar, Hurricane Zara's fury had reached apocalyptic proportions. The massive steel doors were buckling under wind loads that exceeded 250 miles per hour, and Sarah could hear the tortured groaning of metal as the structure fought to maintain its integrity. Through her headset, she could hear Colonel Hartwell coordinating with the ground crew from the safety of a reinforced bunker. Sarah, we're showing green lights across all primary systems. Hartwell's voice crackled through the static-filled communication channel. Engine startup is normal, flight controls are responding, and fuel load is at maximum. Sarah acknowledged the report while her eyes swept across the F-22's instrument displays. The aircraft's fly-by-wire system was already compensating for the violent air currents that were infiltrating the hangar through gaps in the deteriorating structure. Even on the ground, she could feel the fighter jet being buffeted by wind forces that would have torn apart smaller aircraft. Ground control, this is Falcon 1, Sarah said, using the emergency call sign they had established. Request immediate clearance for emergency departure. Structural failure of the hangar appears imminent. Falcon 1, you are cleared for immediate departure, came General Hawkins' voice over the radio. Be advised, all navigation aids are offline, weather radar is inoperative, and you'll be flying completely on instruments and visual reference. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her chest as she advanced the throttles and felt the F-22's twin engines respond with their characteristic howl. The aircraft's thrust vectoring nozzles automatically adjusted for the cross winds that were already affecting the fighter, even inside the hangar. Ground crew, clear the hangar immediately, Sarah announced. I'm beginning taxi operations. Through her canopy, she could see the maintenance technicians running for the reinforced bunkers as the hangar doors began their agonizing opening sequence. What lay beyond those doors was atmospheric chaos that would challenge every system on the aircraft and every skill Sarah had developed over 15 years of flying. The hangar doors reached full open, positioned just as a massive gust of wind slammed into the structure, causing the entire building to sway dramatically. Sarah could see debris flying past the opening at incredible velocity, chunks of metal, tree branches, and unidentifiable objects that Hurricane Zara had torn from structures across the region. Falcon 1, be advised that wind speeds at ground level are exceeding 260 miles per hour with gusts approaching 300, Hartwell reported. Recommend full afterburner for takeoff to minimize ground exposure time. Sarah acknowledged and selected full military power, feeling the F-22 surge forward with acceleration that pressed her back into the ejection seat. The moment the aircraft cleared the hangar threshold, Hurricane Zara seized it like a predator, capturing prey. The fighter jet was immediately slammed sideways by a crosswind. That would have been fatal for any conventional aircraft. But Zara had anticipated the assault, and her control inputs were already compensating for the violent air currents. The F-22's flight control computers screamed warnings about operating outside normal parameters, but the aircraft responded to her commands with the precision that made it one of the world's premier fighters. "Jesus Christ," came Hartwell's voice over the radio. "Zara, how are you maintaining control in those conditions?" Zara didn't have time to respond. Every fraction of a second required total concentration as she fought to keep the F-22 aligned with the runway while winds tried to flip the aircraft inverted. The heads-up display showed airspeed fluctuations of over 200 knots as she encountered alternating headwinds and tailwinds that changed direction without warning. At rotation speed, Zara pulled back on the stick and felt the F-22 leap into the air with an acceleration that defied the laws of physics. But the moment the aircraft left ground contact, Hurricane Zara's full fury was unleashed against it. The fighter jet was immediately caught in a vertical wind shear that tried to slam it back into the runway. Zara fought the controls as G-forces exceeded 8 Gs, pressing her down into the seat with crushing weight. The aircraft's structural stress warning systems activated as the airframe encountered loads that approached its design limits. "Falcon 1, we've lost telemetry." Hartwell's voice was strained with tension. "Zara, do you copy?" "I copy," Zara gasped through the G-forces. "Aircraft is responding, but barely. These wind shears are beyond anything I've ever encountered." She pulled the F-22 into a steep climb, using the aircraft's incredible thrust-to-weight ratio to power through atmospheric turbulence that would have destroyed any other fighter. At 10,000 feet, she encountered a downdraft so violent that the aircraft dropped 3,000 feet in less than 10 seconds, subjecting her to negative G-forces that made her vision go red around the edges. The F-22's flight control computers were working overtime to maintain stability, but Zara could feel the systems approaching their limits. The fly-by-wire technology that made the aircraft manageable in normal conditions was struggling to process the chaotic atmospheric data that Hurricane Zara was generating. At 20,000 feet, Zara thought she might have climbed above the worst of the turbulence, but she was wrong. Hurricane Zara's convective towers extended well into the stratosphere, creating vertical wind currents that no aircraft had ever been designed to handle. The F-22 was caught in an updraft that accelerated it upward at over 5,000 feet per minute, then slammed into a downdraft that tried to tear the wings from the fuselage. "Warning, structural stress approaching critical limits," announced the aircraft's automated systems. "Recommend immediate reduction in flight loads." Zara almost laughed at the computer's suggestion. Reducing flight loads wasn't an option when you were trapped inside a Category 5 hurricane, fighting for survival against atmospheric forces that could crush a fighter jet like an empty soda can. At 35,000 feet, she finally began to see breaks in the storm clouds. Hurricane Zara's eye wall was a towering cylinder of convective activity that rose like a malevolent cathedral into the upper atmosphere. But between the spiral bands of clouds, Zara could glimpse patches of blue sky that represented escape, routes to calmer air. "Falcon 1, this is MacDill Air Force Base Emergency Control," came a new voice over the radio. "We're tracking an unidentified aircraft in Hurricane Zara's eye wall. Please identify yourself and state your intentions." "MacDill Control, this is Captain Sarah Mitchell, United States Air Force, flying emergency evacuation mission in F-22 Raptor," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the aircraft bucking around her like an enraged animal. "Requesting immediate clearance for emergency landing. Aircraft has sustained stress damage and fuel is becoming critical. Captain Mitchell, confirmed emergency clearance. Be advised, our runway is experiencing crosswinds exceeding 150 miles per hour. Landing conditions are extremely hazardous." Sarah looked at her fuel gauges and realized she didn't have enough remaining to reach an alternate airfield. MacDill Air Force Base was her only option, even if the landing would be nearly as dangerous as the takeoff had been. MacDill Control, beginning. Approach for emergency landing, Zara announced. Falcon 1 is coming home. As she maneuvered the battered F-22 toward the approach corridor, Zara realized that she had accomplished something unprecedented in aviation history. She had successfully flown a fighter jet through the eye wall of a Category 5 hurricane and survived. But the mission wasn't over yet. She still had to land the aircraft in wind conditions that would challenge even her extraordinary skills. Hurricane Zara wasn't finished with her yet, and the most dangerous part of the flight was still ahead. The approach to MacDill Air Force Base looked like a descent into hell. Through the F-22's canopy, Zara could see the runway illuminated by emergency lighting, but it appeared to be swimming in a sea of horizontal rain and debris. The crosswinds were so violent that the aircraft's flight path resembled a controlled crash more than a conventional landing approach. MacDill Tower, Falcon 1 is on final approach, Zara announced, her voice tight with concentration as she fought to maintain the proper glide slope. Aircraft is experiencing severe control difficulties due to wind shear. Request emergency vehicles standing by. Falcon 1, emergency response teams are in position, came the tower controller's reply. Be advised we're showing sustained crosswinds of 165 miles per hour with gusts approaching 200. Recommend you consider alternate options. Zara almost laughed at the suggestion. Her fuel gauges were showing critically low levels. The F-22 had sustained structural damage from the flight through Hurricane Zara's eye wall, and there were no alternate airfields within range that could handle a fighter jet. MacDill Air Force Base was her only option, regardless of how impossible the landing conditions appeared. Negative, MacDill. Fuel state is critical, and aircraft damage precludes extended flight. I'm committed to this approach. At 1,000 feet above ground level, Zara encountered a wind shear so violent that it felt like the aircraft had hit an invisible wall. The F-22 was suddenly traveling sideways at over 100 miles per hour, while still maintaining forward momentum, creating a flight vector that violated every principle of aerodynamics. Only the fighter's advanced flight control systems prevented an immediate stall and spin that would have been fatal. Zara's hands flew across the controls, making constant adjustments to counteract the chaotic air currents. The aircraft's angle of attack indicator was fluctuating wildly as she fought to maintain lift in conditions where the very concept of stable flight became meaningless. Through her peripheral vision, she could see the structural stress displays showing yellow and red warnings as the F-22's airframe approached its breaking point. At 500 feet, another massive downdraft caught the aircraft and slammed it toward the runway with bone-crushing force. Zara pulled back on the stick and applied full throttle, feeling the twin engines respond with a roar that was barely audible over the howling wind. The heads-up display showed a vertical descent rate that would have been fatal if it continued for another few seconds. "Come on, baby," Zara whispered to the F-22, treating the sophisticated machine like a living creature that needed encouragement to survive the impossible. "Just a little bit more. We're almost home." The fighter jet clawed its way back to the proper approach angle, but Zara could feel the aircraft systems beginning to fail under the extraordinary stress. The flight control computers were generating error messages faster than they could be processed, and several backup systems had already shut down to prevent cascading failures. At 200 feet above the runway, Zara faced the final challenge of the landing approach. The crosswinds were so severe that conventional landing techniques would result in certain catastrophe. Instead, she had to employ a technique called crabbing, flying the aircraft sideways into the wind while maintaining forward progress toward the runway threshold. The F-22 was now flying at a 45-degree angle to its direction of travel. Its nose pointed into the hurricane winds while its flight path carried it toward the runway centerline. To observers on the ground, it must have looked like the fighter jet was attempting some kind of aerobatic maneuver rather than conducting an emergency landing. "Falcon 1, you are severely off centerline," the tower controller warned. "Recommend go around if possible." "Negative, MacDill. I'm exactly where I need to be," Sarah replied, her voice reflecting the confidence that came from years of flying in impossible conditions. "Trust me on this one." At 50 feet above the runway, Sarah began the most critical maneuver of the entire flight. She had to transition from the crab approach angle to a wings-level landing configuration in the few seconds before touchdown. The timing had to be perfect too early, and the crosswinds would blow the aircraft off the runway. Too late, and the F-22 would touch down sideways and cartwheel into destruction. Sarah counted down in her head, 3.2.1. At exactly the right moment, she applied full rudder to swing the aircraft's nose back to runway heading while simultaneously using the ailerons to level the wings. The F-22 responded like a precision instrument, its advanced flight controls making micro-adjustments faster than any human pilot could process. The main landing gear touched down with a jarring impact that sent shockwaves through the entire airframe. Sarah immediately deployed the drag chute and applied maximum braking, feeling the aircraft decelerate with forces that pressed her forward against her restraint harness. But the F-22 was still traveling at over 200 miles per hour in a crosswind that was trying to push it off the runway and into the emergency vehicles parked along the taxiway. The fighter jet began to slide sideways despite Sarah's best efforts to maintain directional control. The anti-skid braking system was cycling frantically as the wheels alternately gripped and slipped on the rain-soaked runway surface. Through her canopy, Sarah could see the runway edge lights flashing past it, terrifying speed as the aircraft continued its sideways drift. "Runway departure imminent," announced the F-22's automated warning system. "Eject, eject, eject." But Sarah wasn't ready to give up. She had brought the aircraft this far through conditions that should have been impossible to survive, and she wasn't going to lose it now to a landing mishap. She applied asymmetric braking and differential thrust vectoring, using every trick she had learned in 15 years of flying to regain control of the sliding fighter jet. Slowly, incrementally, the F-22 began to respond to her inputs. The sideways drift decreased, then stopped, then gradually reversed as Sarah managed to align the aircraft with the runway centerline. The airspeed decreased through 100 miles per hour, then 50, then finally dropped to taxi speed as the fighter jet rolled to a stop less than 500 feet from the end of the runway. For a moment, Sarah sat in the cockpit in stunned silence, unable to believe that she had actually survived what was arguably the most dangerous flight in aviation history. The F-22's engines wound down to idle with their characteristic whine, and the only sound was the continued howling of Hurricane Zara's winds outside the aircraft. "Falcon 1, MacDill Tower," came the controller's voice, filled with unmistakable awe. "That was the most incredible piece of flying any of us have ever witnessed. Welcome to MacDill Air Force Base, Captain Mitchell." Sarah keyed her microphone with a shaking hand. "MacDill Tower, Falcon 1 is on deck and secure. Thanks for keeping the lights on." As emergency vehicles surrounded the F-22 and ground crews began securing the aircraft against the continuing hurricane winds, Sarah realized that she had accomplished something unprecedented. She had successfully evacuated a $350 million fighter jet from a collapsing hangar, flown it through the eye wall of a Category 5 hurricane, and landed it safely in conditions that would have been impossible for any other pilot to survive. But more than that, she had proven that experience, skill, and professional courage could triumph over circumstances that seemed beyond human capabilities. The secretary, who had been dismissed and overlooked, had just demonstrated why expertise should never be ignored when lives and national assets are at stake. Hurricane Zara continued to rage outside, but Sarah Mitchell had brought the F-22 Raptor home safely. The impossible mission was complete, and the woman who everyone thought was just a secretary had just made aviation history. The most dangerous part of her journey was over, but Sarah sensed that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. 6 hours after Hurricane Zara made landfall, the storm had finally moved inland and begun to weaken, leaving behind a trail of destruction that would take months to fully assess. At MacDill Air Force Base, Sarah sat in the base commander's office, still wearing her flight suit and trying to process the magnitude of what she had accomplished. Across the desk sat General Patricia Hawkins, who had flown to MacDill as soon as weather conditions permitted. Beside her was Colonel Robert Chun, the base commander, and Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who had insisted on coming to debrief Sarah about the atmospheric conditions she had encountered during the flight. "Captain Mitchell," General Hawkins began, "I've been flying military aircraft for over 25 years, and I can state categorically that what you accomplished today was the most extraordinary feat of aviation I have ever witnessed or heard described." Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair. After 3 years of being invisible and overlooked, the intensity of the attention was almost overwhelming. "General, I was just doing what needed to be done. The F-22 had to be evacuated, and I happened to have the right experience for the mission." "Happened to have the right experience?" Colonel Chun interjected with a slight smile. "Captain, you flew a fighter jet through the eye wall of a Category 5 hurricane and landed it in crosswinds that exceeded the aircraft's certified operating limits. That's not luck, that's skill at a level that defies description." Dr. Walsh leaned forward with obvious excitement. "Sarah, the atmospheric data we collected from your flight is unprecedented. You encountered wind shears exceeding 250 knots, vertical accelerations over 12 gigaseconds, and turbulence levels that our instruments couldn't properly measure. The fact that you maintained control of the aircraft under those conditions suggests a level of pilot skill that we thought was purely theoretical." Sarah looked around the room at the faces of the senior officers and specialists, seeing a level of professional respect that she hadn't experienced since her days at weapons school. But there was something else in their expressions, a recognition that they were in the presence of someone who had redefined what was possible in military aviation. "General," Sarah said quietly, "I need to ask about the official status of today's mission. My retirement from the Air Force was complicated. I want to make sure that my actions today don't create legal or administrative problems." General Hawkins' expression grew serious. "Captain Mitchell, I've spent the last several hours reviewing the circumstances of your retirement from active duty. The official findings regarding the incident with your squadron were, to put it mildly, a travesty of military justice." She pulled out a thick folder and placed it on the desk. "The investigation that ended your career was conducted by officers who had never flown combat missions and had no understanding of the tactical realities you faced. Your decision to break formation saved 4 pilots' lives, and any competent review board would have recognized that." Sarah felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "General, Captain Torres died because he followed my recommendation." Captain Torres died because surface-to-air missiles were fired at your formation," General Hawkins interrupted firmly. "You made a split-second tactical decision that saved 4 out of 5 pilots in an impossible situation. The fact that 1 pilot didn't survive doesn't make your decision wrong. It makes war tragic." Colonel Chun opened another folder and began reading from official documents. "Captain Mitchell, based on your actions today and a review of your complete service record, the Air Force is prepared to offer you several options. First, we can arrange for your complete reinstatement to active duty with full rank and honors." Sarah's heart skipped. "Sir, I'm 42 years old. I've been away from military flying for 3 years. I'm not sure. Second, Colonel Chun continued, we can offer you a position as a civilian contractor with the Air Force Test Pilot School, where your expertise in extreme weather flying would be invaluable for training the next generation of military aviators. Dr. Walsh added, there's also a third option. NASA has expressed interest in your skills for their atmospheric research programs. Flying through Hurricane Zara demonstrated capabilities that could be crucial for studying severe weather phenomena and developing better forecasting models. Sarah sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of her professional fortunes. 3 days ago, she had been a secretary whose expertise was dismissed and ignored. Now she was being offered positions that would place her at the forefront of military and civilian aviation. General, she said slowly, I need some time to consider these options. But first, I want to know about the people at Maxwell Defense. Are they safe? All personnel were successfully evacuated before the hangar collapsed, General Hawkins replied. The facility sustained significant damage, but there were no casualties. Your decision to evacuate the F-22 not only saved a valuable aircraft, it probably saved the lives of anyone who might have been trapped in the hangar when it failed. Colonel Chun pulled out a newspaper that had been rushed to print with coverage of Hurricane Zara's impact. The front page featured a dramatic photograph of the F-22 taking off from the collapsing hangar, with Sarah visible in the cockpit. The headline read, Hurricane Hero, Former Secretary Saves Fighter Jet in Impossible Flight. Captain Mitchell, he said, your story is already becoming legendary throughout the aviation community. Pilots around the world are calling what you did the Hurricane flight, and it's being studied as an example of what's possible when extraordinary skill meets desperate circumstances. Sarah looked at the photograph and barely recognized herself in the cockpit of the F-22. Woman in that image looked confident and determined, nothing like the defeated, overlooked secretary she had been just days earlier. There's something else, General Hawkins added. The Pentagon is recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross for your actions today. It's not often that we see demonstrations of aviation skill that literally rewrite the textbooks on what's possible. General, I don't need medals or recognition, Sarah replied. I just want to make sure that what happened to me, being silenced when I tried to speak up about safety issues, doesn't happen to other pilots. That's exactly why we need you back in positions of authority, Colonel Chun said. The Air Force needs leaders who understand that expertise can come from unexpected places, and that listening to experienced voices can mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. As the debriefing session continued, Sarah found herself thinking about the young pilots who would follow in her footsteps. She thought about the engineers and technicians who had watched her confrontation with Dr. Cross, seeing someone finally stand up for professional judgment over corporate politics. Most importantly, she thought about Captain David Torres, her wingman who had died 3 years ago. His death had ended her military career and nearly destroyed her spirit, but in a strange way, it had also prepared her for today's mission. The experience of losing someone because warnings were ignored had given her the courage to speak up when lives were at stake, even when it meant risking everything she had rebuilt. General, Sarah said finally, I'd like to accept the position with the Test Pilot School. If my experience can help train pilots to handle impossible situations, then maybe some good can come from everything that's happened. General Hawkins smiled. Captain Mitchell, I think that's exactly where you belong. Welcome back to the United States Air Force. As Sarah shook hands with the senior officers, she realized that her journey from invisible secretary to aviation legend was complete. But more than personal vindication, she had proven that experience and expertise should never be dismissed, regardless of where they're found. The hurricane had passed, but Sarah Mitchell's impact on military aviation was just beginning. 3 months after Hurricane Zara, Sarah stood before a classroom filled with the Air Force's most promising young pilots at Edwards Air Force Base in California. The test pilot school auditorium was packed beyond capacity with additional observers, watching via video link from bases around the world. Word had spread throughout the aviation community about the Hurricane flight, and everyone wanted to hear from the pilot who had redefined what was possible in extreme weather conditions. "The most important lesson I can teach you," Sarah began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that came from surviving the impossible, "is that your most valuable instrument isn't in the cockpit, it's between your ears. Computers can process data, but they can't read the sky. That skill comes from experience, observation, and the willingness to trust your instincts when everything else fails." Behind her, a large screen displayed footage from her flight through Hurricane Zara, captured by the F-22's onboard cameras. The young pilots watched in fascination as the video showed atmospheric turbulence that seemed to defy the laws of physics, with the aircraft being tossed around like a toy in the hands of an angry giant. "Major Mitchell," called out Lieutenant Sarah Chun, one of the brightest students in the current class. "How did you maintain control when the flight computers were showing system failures?" Sarah smiled at the formal address. Her promotion to Major had come through shortly after her return to the Air Force, along with the Distinguished Flying Cross that now sat in the place of honor in her office. But more important than the rank or decorations was the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged. "Lieutenant, the key is understanding that computers are tools, not substitutes for pilot judgment," Sarah replied. During the Hurricane flight, the F-22's flight control systems were overwhelmed by atmospheric data that exceeded their programming parameters. The aircraft was trying to process information about wind conditions that no computer had ever been designed to handle. She clicked to the next slide, showing technical diagrams of the F-22's fly-by-wire systems. "In those moments, I had to switch from relying on automated systems to flying the aircraft manually, using techniques I learned from flying older fighters that didn't have computer assistance. Sometimes the most advanced solution is knowing when to go back to basics." Lieutenant Mark Rodriguez raised his hand. "Ma'am, how do you develop that kind of instinctive flying ability?" "Practice, study, and humility," Sarah answered. "But most importantly, you need to listen to experienced pilots who've been where you're going." During my civilian years, I was dismissed as just a secretary because people couldn't see past my job title to recognize my actual qualifications. Don't make that mistake with others' expertise can come from unexpected places. The class session continued for another hour, with Sarah sharing lessons learned from her years of flying in combat conditions and extreme weather. But the most important message she wanted to convey went beyond technical flying skills. After the formal presentation, Sarah was approached by Colonel Jennifer Walsh, who had transitioned from Maxwell Defense to become the Air Force's new Director of Weather Operations. The two women had developed a close professional relationship based on their shared experience during Hurricane Zara. "Sarah, I wanted to update you on the changes we've implemented based on your recommendations," Walsh said as they walked toward Sarah's office. "The new safety reporting protocols ensure that weather concerns from any qualified source receive immediate review, regardless of the reporter's position or rank." "That's exactly what we needed," Sarah replied. "How many lives could have been saved over the years if people had listened to experienced voices, instead of dismissing them based on politics or hierarchy?" They passed the base's memorial wall, where photos of fallen aviators served as a constant reminder of the price of aviation mistakes. Sarah paused in front of a recent addition, a photo of Captain David Torres, whose death had been officially reclassified as a combat loss rather than the result of pilot error. "Jennifer, I want to show you something," Sarah said, pulling out a letter that had arrived that morning. "This came from Captain Torres' family. They wanted to thank me for clearing his name and ensuring that his sacrifice is properly recognized. Walsh read the letter with obvious emotion. Sarah, you didn't just save an F-22 during Hurricane Zara. You saved the reputation of a good pilot and gave his family closure they'd been denied for 3 years. As they entered Sarah's office, they were greeted by the sight of Tom Rodriguez, the former maintenance chief from Maxwell Defense. He had accepted Sarah's offer to join the test pilot school as senior maintenance advisor, bringing his decades of practical experience to complement the school's theoretical curriculum. "Major Mitchell," Rodriguez said with a grin, "I just finished inspecting the F-22 you flew through Hurricane Zara. The engineers want to study the stress patterns on the airframe to understand how it survived forces that should have torn it apart." "What did you find?" Sarah asked. "Microfractures in the wing structure, stress deformation in the engine mounts, and control surface wear that indicates the aircraft was pushed well beyond its design limits," Rodriguez replied. "But here's the amazing part. Everything held together because you flew it exactly right. A less skilled pilot would have overstressed the airframe and caused catastrophic failure." Sarah looked around her office at the awards, commendations, and photographs that marked her return to military aviation. But the items that meant the most to her were the letters from young pilots who had been inspired by her story, and the policy changes that ensured other experienced aviators wouldn't face the dismissal and silencing she had endured. "Tom," she said, "I want you to prepare a briefing for the next class about the importance of listening to maintenance concerns. Some of the best safety insights come from the people who actually work on these aircraft every day." "Already on it, Major. In fact, I'm working with Dr. Cross on a presentation about corporate culture and safety reporting." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Amanda Cross? How is she adjusting to her new role?" After the Hurricane Zara incident, Dr. Cross had been reassigned to a position focused on safety and risk management, a role that better suited her analytical skills while removing her from operational decision-making. The experience had taught her valuable lessons about the difference between corporate leadership and aviation safety. "She's actually becoming quite good at it," Rodriguez replied. "Turns out that when she focuses on preventing accidents instead of meeting deadlines, she's pretty effective. She even asked me to tell you that she'd like to guest lecture in your course about learning from corporate mistakes." As the afternoon progressed, Sarah reviewed applications from pilots seeking admission to the test pilot school. The school had become more popular than ever, with aviators from around the world wanting to train at the institution where the Hurricane pilot taught advanced flying techniques. But Sarah's favorite part of each day was the evening flight training, when she took students up in advanced aircraft and taught them to read the sky the way she had learned to do through years of experience and careful observation. These flights reminded her why she had fallen in love with aviation in the first place, the pure joy of mastering a machine and using it to explore the boundaries of what was possible. As she prepared to leave her office, Sarah noticed a new email from General Hawkins. The subject line read, "Special Assignment Opportunity." The message described a classified program to develop new extreme weather flying techniques for military operations in climate-disrupted environments. Sarah smiled as she read the details. It seemed that her journey from forgotten secretary to aviation pioneer was far from over. The military was finally recognizing that climate change would require new approaches to flying in severe weather, and they wanted her expertise to lead the development of those capabilities. 3 months ago, Sarah Mitchell had been invisible, overlooked, and professionally silenced. Now she was being asked to shape the future of military aviation and train the next generation of pilots who would fly in an increasingly dangerous world. The woman who everyone thought was just a secretary had become one of the most respected voices in military aviation, proving that expertise and experience should never be dismissed, regardless of where they're found. But most importantly, Sarah had ensured that other qualified voices would be heard, that safety concerns would be taken seriously, and that the Mistakes that had nearly cost lives during Hurricane Zara would never be repeated. Her transformation was complete. But her mission to change military aviation culture was just beginning. 1 year after Hurricane Zara, Sarah Mitchell stood on the flight line at Edwards Air Force Base, watching as Lieutenant Sarah Chun conducted her final test flight before graduating from the test pilot school. The young pilot had specifically requested to fly the same F-22 that Sarah had evacuated during the hurricane, the aircraft that had become legendary throughout the aviation community as Hurricane 1. The fighter jet gleamed in the California sunshine, its angular surfaces bearing small commemorative markings that honored the extraordinary flight through the storm. But more importantly to Sarah, it represented something larger than a single heroic moment. It symbolized the power of recognizing expertise, wherever it's found, and the importance of listening to experienced voices before it's too late. Major Mitchell called out Colonel Robert Chun, who had been promoted to head the Air Force's new Extreme Weather Operations Division. The Pentagon has approved your proposal for the Advanced Weather Flying Program. You'll have full authority to develop training protocols for climate-related challenges and an unlimited budget to recruit the best weather pilots from around the world. Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The program would ensure that future pilots had the skills and knowledge needed to operate in the increasingly severe weather patterns that climate change was bringing to military operations. More importantly, it would institutionalize the lesson that experience and practical knowledge were just as valuable as advanced technology. "Sir, I want Tom Rodriguez as my deputy director," Sarah said. "His understanding of how aircraft respond to extreme conditions is unmatched, and his experience with practical maintenance under stress conditions will be invaluable." "Already approved," Colonel Chun replied with a smile. "Rodriguez will also be developing new training protocols for ground crews working in severe weather environments. His insights about equipment limitations and human factors have impressed everyone at the Pentagon." As they spoke, Dr. Jennifer Walsh approached with a tablet displaying real-time weather data from around the globe. As the Air Force's Director of Weather Operations, she had revolutionized how the military approached meteorological analysis and safety protocols. "Sarah, I wanted to show you this," Walsh said, highlighting a severe storm system approaching military installations in the Pacific. 6 months ago, this would have grounded all flight operations for days. But using your protocols and training methods, our pilots successfully conducted critical missions while maintaining complete safety margins. Sarah studied the data with professional interest. The storm system was severe but manageable with proper planning and execution, exactly the kind of challenge that her training programs were designed to address. "How many pilots have completed the extreme weather certification?" "Over 200 so far, with requests for training coming from allied nations around the world," Walsh replied. "Your techniques are being adopted by NATO forces, and several civilian aviation organizations want to incorporate your methods into their safety training." The impact of Sarah's story had spread far beyond military aviation. Commercial airlines were revising their extreme weather protocols. Engineering schools were teaching courses on the importance of practical experience, and corporate leadership programs were using her confrontation with Dr. Cross as a case study in listening to expert voices regardless of organizational hierarchy. Major Mitchell came a familiar voice behind them. Sarah turned to see Dr. Amanda Cross, who had arrived for the quarterly safety review meeting. In her new role as Director of Safety and Risk Management, Cross had become one of the most effective advocates for operational safety in the defense industry. "Amanda, how are the new reporting protocols working at Maxwell Defense?" Sarah asked. "Remarkably well," Cross replied with obvious enthusiasm. "We've implemented anonymous safety reporting systems, mandatory review processes for all technical concerns, and regular briefings where anyone with relevant experience can present safety insights. The culture has completely changed, we now actively seek out diverse perspectives instead of dismissing them." Cross paused, her expression becoming more personal. "Sarah, I also wanted to tell you that my daughter is applying for pilot training next year. She says she wants to be like Hurricane Mitchell, the pilot who proved that expertise matters more than politics." Sarah felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. The idea that her story was inspiring a new generation of aviators to pursue their dreams while maintaining their professional integrity was more rewarding than any medal or promotion. "Amanda, make sure she understands that the most important skill any pilot can develop is the courage to speak up when safety is at stake, even when it's uncomfortable or career-threatening." As the afternoon progressed, Sarah found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from invisible secretary to legendary aviator. The Hurricane flight had lasted less than 2 hours, but its impact would continue for decades as new safety protocols, training methods, and cultural changes rippled through the aviation community. Lieutenant Sheen's test flight concluded successfully, and Sarah watched with pride as the young pilot taxied Hurricane 1 back to the hangar. Shun would graduate tomorrow and begin her career as a test pilot, armed with skills and knowledge that would help her navigate whatever challenges the future might bring. "Major," Chun called out as she climbed down from the cockpit, "I wanted to thank you for everything you've taught us. But most importantly, thank you for showing us that expertise can come from anywhere, and that standing up for what's right is always worth the risk." Sarah smiled as she shook the young pilot's hand. "Lieutenant, the best way to thank me is to pass these lessons on to the pilots who come after you. Make sure they understand that listening to experienced voices and trusting professional judgment can mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure." As the sun set over Edwards Air Force Base, Sarah walked to her office to review applications from pilots seeking admission to her advanced training programs. The demand for extreme weather flying instruction had exceeded all expectations, with aviators from military and civilian organizations around the world wanting to learn from the pilot, who had redefined what was possible in severe atmospheric conditions. But Sarah's proudest achievement wasn't the technical advances or the new training protocols. It was the cultural change she had helped create. Throughout the aviation community, people were learning to value experience over hierarchy, practical knowledge over theoretical credentials, and professional courage over political convenience. The secretary who had been dismissed as invisible had become one of the most influential voices in modern aviation. The woman whose warnings were ignored had created systems that ensured future warnings would be heard and heeded. The pilot whose career was destroyed by bureaucratic politics had rebuilt not just her own professional life, but had improved the entire culture of military aviation. Sarah Mitchell's story had become more than a tale of individual heroism. It was a reminder that expertise and wisdom can be found in unexpected places, and that the person everyone overlooks might be exactly the one you need when everything goes wrong. Hurricane Zara had passed into history, but the lessons it taught would continue to save lives for generations to come. The hurricane pilot's greatest victory wasn't surviving impossible flying conditions. It was ensuring that others qualified. Voices would never again be silenced when lives hung in the balance. In conference rooms and briefing halls around the world, Sarah's story was being told to new aviators, corporate leaders, and military commanders. The message was always the same: listen to experience, value expertise wherever you find it, and never let organizational politics override professional judgment. Some storms last for hours, but their impact can change the world forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.